Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, here in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And if you have not already done so, please silence your phones. I note with sadness the death of Mississippi State University professor James Adams. In 2019, Jim and his wife Natalie gave a great History's Lunch program on their book, Just Trying to Have School, The Struggle for Desegregation in Mississippi. If any of y'all were here, you may remember that Natalie had to give the program. Jim was fighting cancer at that time and came with her, but had rallied and finally it caught him. This Friday, October 29th, from noon to 3:30 p.m., spend a day as an archaeologist here at the museums. You'll learn to clean artifacts excavated in Mississippi. It sounds a little Tom Sawyerish, but I promise it's all right. Try your hand at reconstructing a broken reproduction vessel. Use stone tools to shave a deer hide and learn more about the early peoples of Mississippi through guided tours of our archaeological exhibits. For more information, you can visit the Museum of Mississippi History Facebook page. And then join us next week for History's Lunch when Stephen Monroe, chair of the Department of Writing and Rhetoric at the University of Mississippi, will be with us to discuss his new book, Heritage and Hate, Old South Rhetoric at Southern Universities. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our friend Teresa Nicholas to discuss her new memoir, The Mama Chronicles, published by University Press of Mississippi. Nicholas is a freelance writer and has contributed articles and essays to Delta Magazine, Mississippi Magazine, The Bitter Southerner, and NPR's Opinion Page, and has been a travel writer for photos in Mexico and Guatemala. Nicholas's other books include Burying Daddy, Putting My Lebanese, Catholic, Southern Baptist Childhood to Rest, and Willie, The Life of Willie Morris, both of which she did excellent History's Lunch programs for. We're looking forward to today. Help me welcome Teresa Nicholas.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for being here today. It's so nice to see people. Haven't seen people in a long time. And welcome to all of you who may be tuning into Facebook who are still in your slippers and house robes. Oh, this is my book. I'm especially glad to be here today at History is Lunch because of one word, and that is the word history. In a way, the word is appropriate for this book. The Mama Chronicles is a memoir, which of course means that the events in it are taken from life and are as true as I can make them, given the ravages of time and the vagaries of history and memory, rather. But the book also contains a history section. This history comes in 2 chapters towards the end of the book, in the form of oral or spoken history that I took down from my mother while she was living in the nursing home in Yazoo City, Martha Coker Greenhouses. To write these chapters, I relied on those interviews that I did with my mother back in the fall of 2008, but also I relied on histories written by relatives and distributed at family gatherings. My mother did not really ever want to talk very much about herself and her upbringing as a sharecropper. Yet she did, for me, in what I call an act of love on her part. And as she talks about what life was like for sharecroppers in the 20s and the 30s in Mississippi, she talks about what their houses and furniture were made of, what their work days in the fields were like, what they grew and ate, and even how she played as a child. Which is to say, she played on bales of cotton when she tried to stand upside down and put her head in them, and she liked to play on leaves. She said once to me, "My mother went to town and got us a ball, but we didn't know what to do with it." I like that in Spanish, the word historia means both history and story. The Mama Chronicles is my mother's story, or as close to it as I could pry from her. History is, after all, the story we tell ourselves to make meaning of our past and to better understand our present. This book was also my attempt to understand my relationship with my mother, and by extension, understand myself and my relationship with Mississippi. So let me back up a little bit to explain. Excuse me. My first book was Burying Daddy, and it was also a memoir. It attempted to come to terms with my adolescence and with the troubled relationship I had with my father, particularly over civil rights. My father, who may not have been a card-carrying member of the White Citizens Council, nonetheless subscribed to their political views. He tried to make me believe in his beliefs by insisting that I read their literature, which he made sure to leave lying around our living room. To retaliate, I hung a poster of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech on my bedroom wall. Battle lines were drawn. In large part, our fractious relationship was why I left Mississippi and matriculated on a needs-based scholarship to Swarthmore College. It's why I became an expat from the South at age 18. This new book is also a memoir, but unlike Burying Daddy, which dealt with my father, the focus here is my mother. Let me just say from the outset that my parents were very different from one another. My father was Lebanese. My mother, I found out, fifth-generation Mississippian. Here's how I describe them in the new book. She was the outsider, hills to my father's flatland, country to his city, Scots-Irish to his Lebanese, dirt farmer to his small-town merchant. She was chicken feet and chitterlings to his kibbe and mjadra. My mother was born outside of Yazoo City, actually outside of Benton, in a small community called Midway. She used to describe Midway as, quote, just a dip in the road between Benton and Ebenezer. These were the so-called hills in Yazoo County. You may not even know that Yazoo County had hills, because they're hills that cap at 300 feet. In the course of writing the book, I learned that her family had been in Mississippi for 5 generations. From about generation 3 and on, they farmed at Midway. She called them dirt farmers. Some years they sharecropped, borrowing money, a furnish, along with equipment. By equipment, I mean a mule. When my mother was 5, her father decided that he would take the family up into the northern part of the Delta to try his hand farming there. Well, that didn't work out too well. He died soon after in 1929, 2 months before the great stock market crash in October. One morning, my mother watched him slide down the side of a chicken house and die, a heart attack, age 43. This was her first memory. You can see why she wouldn't want to talk about this very much. After that, she and her 9 brothers and sisters and widowed mother sharecropped in the Delta and later on around Midway. My mother graduated from high school at 20 in 1944. That's Benton High. She went on to work for the telephone company and to marry my father when she was 26. Although the book delves into my mother's past, the Mama Chronicles mostly focuses on the events in our lives during the decade starting in 2002, after my husband Jerry and I left New York, where we had lived for 25 years, and moved to the Central Highlands of Mexico to write. During this time, my mother's health was deteriorating, and we also began spending a part of each year in Yazoo City to help take care of her. I came home again, at least part-time. The book tells the background story of our late-to-get-going mother-daughter relationship and how during that decade we became closer as I got to know her better. So the book is my mother's story, but also our mother-daughter story and my story of coming back here to Mississippi. I'd like to read a few minutes from the first chapter of the book. As you'll see, although the subject is quite serious, I've tried to introduce some humor. My mother had a great sense of humor, nuanced and complex, and with a sense of the absurd. She suffered a good bit during her final years, especially when she became paralyzed due to her 4th stroke, but she always had the perspective of humor. The scene I'm about to read takes place on New Year's Eve in 2010. It's a Friday, and my mother is up and sitting in the hearth at the nursing home in Yazoo City. She's just had her hair done, and she's eaten a catfish lunch. My husband, Jerry, and I are visiting her for the afternoon. One, my mother's green house. December 31st, 2010. On a narrow street called Grand Avenue Extension, about 2 miles north of Yazoo City, Mississippi, 6 sprawling, putty-colored buildings rise up from what not long ago was a cotton field. These are the Martha Coker greenhouses, a nursing home where my mother has lived for just over 2 years. Near the entrance to the spacious campus stands a mock traffic sign that reads, "Slow, Elders at Play." My mother's room is in the second house on the right, Hildebrand, named for its oldest elder, a wizened lady who died recently, well up in her 90s. In greenhouse parlance, elder equals residence. To enter the building, we ring the doorbell and wait. That's the protocol. An aide in blue scrubs opens the door, and my husband, Jerry, and I make our way along Hildebrand's short entrance hall. The time is right after dinner, the noon meal, and most of the elders have already returned to their rooms for their naps. But my mother is still sitting in the hearth, her deluxe tracer wheelchair braked to the left of the imitation fireplace. A soap opera plays overhead on the giant flat-screen TV. Our eyes meet across the large open space. I detect a straightening of her spine, the slightest improvement of her posture when she notices us. When I stand before her, she extends her left hand, the fingertips purple, the back dappled with liver spots. I hold her hand briefly before dropping down beside her on the leather couch. When she offers her hand again, I realize what she's trying to tell me. "So they cut your nails," I say. "They look nice." She nods, her lips turning up slightly. Hattie, another aide in blue scrubs, comes over to say hello. "Who cut her nails?" I ask, and Hattie whispers the name, Courtney, the nurse on duty. Nails are nursing staff purview. She goes on to tell me that the Catholics are holding a mass in a private visiting room located off the hearth, and they want my mother to attend, but Hattie isn't sure. She looks to me for a decision. Since my mother's watershed stroke 2 years ago, I've become her interpreter, diviner of her modest wants, reader of her impaired state. For clues, I have my mother's good left hand, though she can sometimes squeeze out a short sentence or choose between 2 possibilities by repeating a word. She can also nod or shake her head, though she often gets these 2 confused. Sometimes she nods yes while saying no. I press my lips close to her ear and take in her sweet, sharp smell. "Do you want to go to Mass or back to bed?" She stares straight ahead, eyes like points of coal behind oversized beige frames. "Mass or bed," I repeat. "You pick." "Bed," she manages, her voice oddly wheezy. The stalwart Hattie goes off to find another aide. It takes 2 aides to get my 5'10", nearly 200-pound mother out of her wheelchair and onto her bed, even with all of Hattie's strength in the automatic lift. Just then, the nurse who cut Mama's nails strides by, and I shout thanks to Courtney across the hearth. After they transfer my mother, the aides open the door to her room, my cue to enter. When she's finally set up to watch TV, I ask my mother if she prefers an old movie on TCM or a rerun of Bonanza. But she starts chopping at the air with her left hand. She inhales deeply, her wide belly moving like a bellows under the pink sheets. Hattie feels inside her scrub shirt pockets. "I don't have my panic button, but I think the nurse is still in the house. I'll go get her." I kneel at my mother's paralyzed right side, not the best place to grab her attention. "What's the matter?" I ask. Before she can try to tell me, Courtney steps into the room, pausing at the door to disinfect her hands at the hanging dispenser. She's in her 30s, athletic, professional, and friendly. Mama fans her left fingers at the nurse in a gesture similar to hello but faster, with each finger moving independently. From the bedside, Courtney looks down at my mother. "What's wrong?" she asks. Mama keeps waving at her. Courtney is repeating her question, "What's wrong?" "Police academy," Mama blurts out. Then she reaches to pick up the box of tissues from the over-the-bed table and frowns into it. "Police academy?" Courtney and I ask in chorus. "Police academy," my mother nods, annoyed. She jabs the tissue box at Courtney. I stifle a laugh, and so, I think, does the young nurse. Part of me would like to tease Mama about the non sequitur, to play up the funny, but I know this isn't the time. "It's frustrating," I say instead, and she frowns harder at the box. "But try to get out just one word that will help us understand what you want. Or better yet, point." She puts the tissue box down with a thud and raises her left arm high in the air and points her index finger toward the ceiling. "Say one word," I repeat, "just one." "Police," she says. It's clear my mother isn't having an emergency, and Courtney goes off to tend to other elders. With the nurse gone, Mama picks up the tissue box again. Again, she looks inside as if she's never seen a tissue box before, but this time she says, "Bottle." "Bottle?" I inspect the box too. "Bottle of what? Bottle of Tylenol?" She shakes her head. "Bottle of milk of magnesia?" But as soon as I ask, I realize that seems unlikely. "Bottle," she sputters, "of rubbing alcohol." Only she pronounces it alcohol. Finally, I think I've got it. Mama used to apply this clear liquid whenever she had an itch. I ask, "Is that red patch on your hairline bothering you again?" She drops the box and reaches around behind her right ear. She looks up at me, black eyes clouded with torture. With her fingernails newly cut, she can't get purchase there. I run into the hallway past the kitchen and toward the hearth. Courtney is in Miss Inez's room, and I'm arm-waved to her like a drowning woman, then hurry back to my mother. I perch on her bed, stroking her right hand. "She's coming," I say. "The nurse is coming. She's helping someone else." My mother scans my face as if memorizing me. "You enjoyed the catfish at lunch?" I ask, trying to distract her. She wheezes, "I am tired of catfish." I'm thrilled she's spoken an entire sentence. "Well," I say, paraphrasing Samuel Johnson's pronouncement about London, "when you're tired of catfish, you're tired of life." "I am tired of life," she counters, which declaration falls dead as a hammer. A few minutes later, Courtney breezes back in and snaps on a pair of fresh latex gloves. She rubs a glob of ointment on my mother's itchy neck. "Is that what you wanted?" I ask her. She beams at Courtney. And so begins this Friday afternoon, those dragged-out hours after dinner that my mother used to call evening when she could still talk. So, you may still be wondering why you might want to read about my mother. There's a great essay written by Scott Russell Saunders. He has Mississippi connections too, by the way, and it's titled Dust. The essay, at its deepest level, is about his friend Malcolm's mother and her death, and about scattering her ashes. Saunders writes, "I rehearsed the hard litany, from ashes to ashes, dust to dust, while thinking of Malcolm's lovely, vanished mother. Every mother, if you think of her steadily enough, becomes your own." And I think that's how I look at it and how I hope readers will look at it. My mother, if you read about her, may become your own. I certainly think she is representative of her generation, those people born up into the late 20s who were called the greatest generation, who grew up during the Depression and fought and lived through World War II. Maybe because of her hard-scrabble past, my mother grew up no-nonsense, practical, and self-sacrificing. When I was young, I was frankly ashamed of her humble beginnings, but as I got to know her better and learned more about her family, I started to feel proud of them for their toughness, So this is not just a story of her life, but of a lot of people like her who went before. She stands for her generation, I think. So during my childhood and adolescence, my mother and I didn't fuss and fight as I did with my father, but we weren't all that close, or so I thought. She was essentially a hands-off kind of mom. I thought she was a little cold, and she could be mean. For example, when I was about 10 or so, I felt she falsely accused me of stamping my feet at the dinner table. So doing what any incipient writer might do, I wrote her a letter, which said, "Dear Mother, you are mean. Please be nice to me." I asked her to check a blank box that I'd drawn on the letter agreeing to be nicer to me. She did not. In fact, she claimed never to have gotten the letter, which I'd left for her on her pillowcase. Such are the hurts of a sensitive childhood. But during her long 4-year stay in the nursing home, we got closer over the course of many visits, spending long hours on the patio watching the clouds or in her room watching Turner Classic Movies. During the decade in which the book takes place, I finally had the close, comfortable years with my mother that I hadn't had growing up. Then, after she died in 2012, Jerry and I bought a house in Jackson, and while unpacking, I uncovered dozens and dozens of letters from my mother that she had written to me while I was at Swarthmore, that I hadn't read in 40 years, and that I'd even forgotten that I had. The letters, describe her task-filled, family-filled life. She preserves figs and pears and puts up fresh beans and peas in the freezer. In one envelope, she included swatches from a dress she was making for me. During that time, she tried to learn a bicycle and took shorthand and bookkeeping classes. In several of the letters, she answered the same question about her childhood that I'd raised in my interviews with her in the nursing home, providing more detail and insight about her early life. In one, I came across the charming photograph of her playing outside her one-room schoolhouse in Washington County. She wrote me that my father said about that photo that in it she looked like the world's tallest first grader. But actually, she told me, she was in the 3rd grade. But most importantly, the letters put a different slant on our relationship, free from the impurities of memory. Let me read just a few paragraphs about the letters. My mother wasn't a letter writer by habit, but I was. My blue trunk, which I was fast discovering to be my own time capsule, contained the note I'd written to her in 3rd grade, imploring her to be nice to me. The note reminded me how she'd seemed distant then and mean. But now I knew that this presumed meanness wasn't hers alone. Others in her family shared the trait. A kind of toughness, I supposed, was necessary to eke out a living dirt farming in Mississippi during the Great Depression. Its hallmarks, non-stop hard work and no complaining. In that harsh world, there hadn't been room for sentiment. We were never close. From as far back as my note to her in 3rd grade, this was the story I had told myself. More than revealing a revised timeline of my mother's past, more than revealing her love for my father, more than anything, the letters told of our forgotten intimacy. She wrote me through college depressions, boyfriend breakups, a bout of mono, bad grades. Only once did her support and positivity waver. During my sophomore year, I felt downhearted and struggled through a period of insomnia. My choice of dorm room and roommate wasn't working out. "You might be in over your head," she wrote, "trying to keep up with all those rich people." Then she apologized for sounding harsh. In her letters, she was a gentle mother, a best girlfriend. "I promised you a first spring flower," she wrote, and pressed a daffodil between the pages. She counted the days into my vacations when she planned long talks about everything. She called me her honey and her darling. She told me how glad she was to have me for her daughter. I was her darling daughter and her dear little daughter. She told me she loved me. On one page, she typed, "I love you," over and over. Almost always, she signed her letters, "Love Mother," not Mama. She may have signed off formally, but she reminded me of the confidants we used to be. She wrote, "It is a lot of nonsense that you believe we cannot be, or never were, very close." Why had I thought we weren't? Rereading her letters, I could again recall feeling ashamed of her hardscrabble past, ashamed of her, and ashamed of having a sharecropper, or dirt farmer as she'd called herself, for my mother. True, she'd been distant, held back perhaps by the tragedies of childbearing and the grind of taking care of 4 young kids, and by her own hard upbringing and lingering sense of shame. But I came to admit this: I had also kept my distance from her. Ultimately, the letters bore out the faultiness of memory. They were filled with words I hadn't remembered, about an early bond with my mother I'd forgotten. They were proof of a mother's love, and they spoke of its mettle and kind. Maybe she couldn't have told me these things, even before her watershed stroke. She'd never been much of a talker, even then. But in the intimacy of the letters, in the exigencies of my college absence, she found her voice. Through her letters, discovered in an army surplus trunk 4 decades later, I heard that voice again, and it was like knowing her for the first time. It was an antidote to mourning. So an important theme of the book is the idea of home and my search for home. When my mother was growing up in Midway, Yazoo City, about 8 miles away, was her favorite go-to town. Not Jackson, not Canton, not Vicksburg, but Yazoo City. She always loved Yazoo City, and here the important thought is, it was the only place she ever wanted to live. She knew her place in the world, and I came to envy her for recognizing that. She was lucky to know where she belonged. When I got to know Yazoo City again as an adult, I grew to appreciate it in a way that I hadn't as a child. I appreciated how kind so many people there could be. I appreciated how they helped me care for my mother. It's not surprising that Yazoo City is practically a character in the book. But although Yazoo City has a lasting place in my memory and in my imagination, I realize it's not my place in the world. Since my mother's death, Jerry and I have sold our house in Mexico, and we still own our house in Jackson. In my search for home, I have to say, I would like to say I know where I belong, but I really can't. It's a little more complicated than that. But in the end, this new memoir becomes a brief meditation on home. And to conclude, I'd like to read a few paragraphs about that idea from the last chapter. There is a place in the imagination, a vast place that encompasses all of us, even our soul, and when we think hard on it, produces a tightness in the throat and eyes that exposes emotions long buried. It is a place we come back to often in our thoughts, reaching backward and even forward in time, for we know we will rest there one day too. If someone were to ask, "Where is your heart?" we would say that place's name, for it is where memory originates and where those we love most continue on. Home is the place of our most indwelling self, the place we feel most obsessed about, the place where even the air smells familiar, the place that somehow dictates all else about us, even if we reject portions of those compulsions. Why did I want to come back to Mississippi? Why didn't I stay in New York or Mexico, where I'd achieved stasis, not able to live in my home state, but not able to live without it? In the end, I just wanted to come home, to stop living in the foreignness, to be around things and places known, to live, as the Mississippi artist Andrew Bucci once told me, closer to the graveyard, to hear the sounds and to be with the people I knew, including most of my remaining family. This provided a kind of antidote to the ever-dawning reality of one's own mortality. I didn't have children to pass a genetic legacy on to, but like my 5 generations of Hood and Gilmore forebears, I would lie in the Mississippi earth. My desire to write about family and home sprang not from an urge to create any literary legacy, but out of a compulsion to dwell in the past, to see my people come alive again, even if only on paper, and maybe to figure something out. In the end, it also came down to my mother. Home is mother. I'd come back home for my mother, the smallest unit of home. She was gone, and the family house was gone, but in my most indwelling place, I still had her. What is remembered, home. Mississippi might be frustrating, at times infuriating, the place and its politics despairingly slow to change and maddeningly contradictory, but it was mine in ways that Mexico and even New York could never be. "You'll never be Mexican," my Spanish teacher and friend Enrique had said during year 1 of my life in his country, when I was trying so hard to learn the language and culture. In my quintessential American way, I thought I could be anything, but he was right. I could only be who I was raised to be, though Mexico would always be part of me, and I would always be part of Mexico. Not long after my mother's house was sold, on an early spring day, we were in the Yazoo Cemetery again with Nick, our nephew, who was half immersed in the fountain, trolling for pennies, his red T-shirt sopping. I saw the lazy blue sky, the brown lacy branches of the trees against it, and I thought how it was all of a piece, again past and present mixing with an awareness of our future. And I felt the wholeness of my life, alive in this place of the dead, of our history, with my mother nearby. It has always been this place. It had always been of a piece. It was land, sky, trees, earth, birds, and water. It was all this that was home. Thank you. I get emotional reading that. So we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has a question.
Questions, anyone?
You spoke of your father passing away, or her father passing away. And they went on to work as sharecroppers.
They were working as sharecroppers before that.
Did they continue after his death?
Mm-hmm. Working as sharecroppers or poor farmers? Yes, up until, let's see. Well, as I said, my mother graduated from high school when she was 20. The war really changed things for them. When World War II came around, her twin brother enlisted when he was 18, I think. Her other brother ran off at 16 to join the army. The family started to disperse, and they moved into Yazoo City. So I would say really with the advent of the war, things began to be different for them. They got jobs in, my mother worked, I mentioned she worked as a telephone operator, but she also worked in a meat packing plant and a lumber yard. This was a step up, you know. And they were centered primarily in Yazoo City, though for a while they lived in Canton. So I'd say the war was really put an end to the farming life for them.
So she had brothers that would have worked on the farm as a sharecropper?
There were 10 kids, equally divided, 5 girls and 5 boys, I believe. Yeah. Big workforce. A lot of families back then, you know, had big kids, lots of kids. 8 seemed to be the magic number in her family. Thought I saw a hand over here.
I wondered if you had any of your mother's recipes as she wrote them, and I wondered if she had any particular flowers in her yard.
That's such a nice question. Well, she never cooked from a recipe. That was sort of traditional back then, I suppose. And it was kind of sad because the funny thing is when I was growing up, I thought she was a terrible cook. She would make these mysterious pieces of meat with lots of gravy and rice, and it was just very unappealing to me. But then when I got older, I realized there were a lot of things that she cooked that were really delicious. Like her biscuits were unbelievable, her cobblers, a big dessert person. But she really never wrote down her recipes to speak of. She did have a recipe box, but it was primarily clippings of things that she cut out when she was older that were not really the old recipes. And as far as flowers are concerned, she loved her iris bed, which I write about in the book. I would say that was probably one of her favorite flowers. This is a nice question. What made you ask the question?
I grew up fortunately, way out in the woods by the creek. And my grandma lived next door. It was lovely. It was lovely. Mm-hmm. It really was.
And there are fig trees in the yard that make appearances throughout.
Yes, everybody had to have a fig tree, especially if you had Lebanese relatives. We had to have a fig tree because it reminded us of the old country. But fig preserving was a big part of the Southern heritage too. It was one of their staple foods, fig preserves. You had a question?
I did. How long did she work for the phone company? I'm curious about that because I retired from the phone company.
Not long enough to get a pension. Unfortunately. But she was proud of her phone company heritage, though.
My mother had worked for the phone company during World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when I got my job with the phone company several years later, she said, "Oh, you'll do fine." She was not worried about me anymore. She said, "You'll make it fine."
We have a question or two from the chat. Let
The
me
virtual
pass
gallery.
those along. What a wonderful thing to find your mother's letters to you during college. How did that find impact the writing of the book? Had you already decided to write the book?
Yeah, I was writing the book. What happened was my mother died in 2012, and I started the book right after she died. I had an agent at the time, and I said I was working on it. And she said, "Oh, don't write another memoir. Memoirs, I can't sell memoirs." So I was like 50,000 words into it when my friend John Langston from the University Press of Mississippi said, "I think you should write a book about Willie Morris." So I took a detour for a few years and wrote the book about Willie. And so I came back to the Mama manuscript probably around 2017, and I had found the letters not too long before that, and it was astonishing to me. I just had no memory of getting that much correspondence from her, and I put them all in order, and I interleaved them with my father's letters and with my grandmother's letters. So I had piles and piles of things to look at, and they just told such a story about not only our relationship but about their lives when I wasn't there. So I was starting to write the end of the book, and I realized that was the end of the book. That would come towards the end of the book. The realization that a lot of the things that I had thought were true weren't really true about my relationship with my mother. So it was just a great find for me, as as a daughter and as a writer. Yes.
You still have the letters?
Of course.
Spoken by an archivist.
I hadn't thought about it. Archives.
If they're telling you a story, what's going on at home,
Yeah.
that's what we want.
That's
we
a
want
good
to know
point.
what was going on.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. I love that idea.
much. Teresa, there was another question from the live stream about the similarities and differences between Mississippi and central Mexico and your experience there.
Well, that might be a book. Well, you know, there are similarities. I mean, one is intense love of family. You know, I mean, having lived in Mexico and met and gotten to know and love many Mexican people and families, I can tell you there's just an intense, as intense here, tradition of the importance of family, and in some way, I think their family is, you know, they cannot rely on government services the way some people here in this country can rely on government services, and what they rely on is their family. So maybe even more so than here, family is an important unit. So I would say that's one similarity. Help me out here, Jerry.
Mexicans are very polite.
Yeah, they're very, manners, of course, you know, and importance of history and tradition is very important in their culture. Some ways that we're not similar, I say we don't really have as many fireworks. Just fireworks, parties. I mean, that's the other thing. They're a very fiesta-loving group, by and large, if I can be indulgent in a complete cliche. But it's a lovely tradition, really, because there's just a sense of lightheartedness about it. Help me out here. I don't know. It's like trying to compare an elephant and a giraffe, but there are similarities. But for me, living there was kind of a rich experience because, unlike people who are from there, I didn't have a past there. I didn't have a lot of memories from there. I felt like I could reinvent myself from the ground up. And one of the things I tried very hard to do is to learn Spanish, which I'm still studying after 18 years. And that was really a great thing for me to have a second language to express myself in. Just and interesting in the way that one's self-expression changes from language to language. I'm a much more upbeat person in Spanish, really.
While I'm walking over there, let me get this on the microphone.
One question. Do you go back to Mexico?
Yes, we try to go back. We're going back mostly once a year now for a long visit in the summer.
I was going to ask a question about Mississippi education. Your family is fascinating, particularly when you consider all the letter writing of multi-generational and so forth and so on. Could you maybe describe what kind of education they received and how they managed to do this while trying to work as dirt farmers, like some of our other people?
Well, I guess my generation was the first generation to go to college. My mother always loved to read. And in fact, her brothers and sisters sort of made fun of her for this. And she told me she would hide in the closet with her book. She read people like, she loved Jane Eyre. Anything with a heroine who was a beleaguered heroine she loved. So, you know, she's a big fan of Jane Eyre, for example. But she was ashamed of herself. She was ashamed of her, what she would call it, illiteracy. She didn't really, I mean, she wrote beautiful letters, you know, just touching, beautiful letters, but she said to me once, I could imagine you reading them and laughing at me. Nothing was further from the truth. But she wouldn't have said she was an educated person, and yet she was a person who always loved to read, and she read a lot. And I think that's true for some members of her family. Other members of the family didn't have that proclivity. My father never really liked to read all that much, so it was a mixed family of readers and non-readers.
Formal schooling?
For most of the people in my family had at least a high school education. Yeah, even in poor parts of Mississippi. As I said, she went to this one-room schoolhouse, and she told me her teacher was named Miss Johnny Couch. And one of the things she remembered most about Miss Johnny Couch was that she came to school every day riding a horse. And the kids would get together, and one person would get to hold the horse's tail, and the next person would hold that kid's hand, and the next person would hold that kid's hand, and they would make a little parade around the schoolyard. I'm not sure she learned a lot, but she had a good time. You know, they had a pot-belly stove, and they had something that passed for desks. But that was her education. And then she did go to Benton High. She was one of 19 who graduated. Most of them were women because most of the guys had already gone off to war. And their annual was called the something like the Flight of the Benton 19 or the B-19, which I have a copy of, which was really precious to me to have. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Were her letters grammatically correct?
No.
Did she use good grammar?
Um,
Or did she use the language that we are used to hearing from dirt farmers?
More of the latter. My mother had a friend whose one of her favorite expressions was, "Don't use ain't because ain't right." I must have heard that a million times growing up. So no, she's the only character in the book who really talks in a vernacular way. And you know, not that she drops her G's or anything like that, but I tried to capture her manner of speaking. It's not just the grammar, but the way she constructed a sentence, which is so unusual to hear, and you don't hear it much anymore.
Just as a point of my remembrance of the schools that my parents went to,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they taught Latin there. Did you know that? They did. The country schools. My mother could speak Latin. I couldn't. She could spell anything. I can't.
Yeah.
So they were educated.
Thank you.
The book is about your mother. The first book, your father. Are your siblings eyeing you, wondering who you're coming after next? How does your family feel about it?
Well, I have this habit when I write of not showing the manuscript to anybody. But when it was finished, I did ask them, my sisters, if they wanted to read it, and they both said no. No, thank you. Since then, one sister has read it and has spoken well of it, and the other sister has read parts of it and said it makes her cry too much, so she hasn't finished reading it. But I feel they're supportive of it. I did send parts of the manuscript to just about everybody in Yazoo City I wrote about, many of whom I did call by name, and I got their approval, if you will, on the manuscript, because I said Yazoo City plays a big role in the book. But no, I think my sisters are very supportive of it. And my 91-year-old aunt Willie Bell read it, and she said, "It's a good book."
After reading it, I am certain that if she hadn't approved of it, it wouldn't have been published.
Yeah, she's a toughie.
She's great.
What did your father do? And did your mother work while you were children?
My father worked for his uncle in his uncle's car dealership in Yazoo City. He was a bookkeeper. And my mother, when we were growing up, worked as our mother. There were 4 of us, and we probably made her crazy. And it was a lot of work. And she was a very good housekeeper. As my Aunt Willie Bell said about someone else in the book, she was a housekeeper and all that entailed. But then when we got older, she went to work for a farm implement company in Yazoo City called Amco. And a lot of the letters she wrote me, she wrote from Amco, which is why she typed them. She didn't like not having anything to do at Amco, but she'd often finish her day's work by noon. And so she would spend some part of the afternoon writing letters to me. So I guess I'm lucky that she had some free time. But she had also write letters, while she was baking a ham on Sunday, or when she was getting her hair done, set under the dryer. But she was a very hard worker, but not necessarily, as we might consider today, people are hard workers who work at a career or a regular job. But she always wanted to be busy.
Other questions? We have copies of the new book, the first book, and the Willie Morris book over here. Thank you all for being here today. I hope that we see you next week. Help me thank Teresa Nicholas for this fabulous program.
Thank you.